Okay, we are live. It is Thursday. Welcome to the Jazz Arts Group and Jazz Academy Facebook pages for another episode of Offstage Live. My name is Zach Compton. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement for the Jazz Arts Group. So thrilled that you could be joining us for another episode. We hope that these episodes, 18 of them now, have been bringing you joy, reminding you of all the things that you love about our jazz community here in Columbus and beyond. I want to remind you that now on Sundays, you can find Byron Stripling live with live music. We can't wait to be bringing you back those concerts. Byron will this weekend on Sunday have the great Bobby Floyd and the piano virtuoso young Micah Thomas on the piano. So please come back on Sunday, 3 p.m. here on the Jazz Arts Group and Jazz Academy Facebook pages. As you may know, Jazzoo 2020 with the Columbus Jazz Orchestra has been canceled. We are planning for a triumphant return in 2020. There have been so many different meetings to imagine what the future will hold for Jazz Arts Group. And the one thing I can tell you is that all of the staff, Byron Stripling, Press Southworth, our CEO, the great board and staff that we have are planning diligently to make sure that the arts and jazz is alive in Columbus well after this pandemic has finished up. And we will be bringing you a combination of virtual programming. We can't wait to get back onto the stage with you live, and we will try to be on the front end of everything happening so that you are right back with us as soon as possible. We want to thank those that have already given to Jazz Arts Group so generously. Nick and Barbara Alexander, Dorothy and Rod Beener, Neil Owens, and Martin and Janice Williamson. Those are just a few of the fine folks that have recognized that at this time, the arts is under attack because of this pandemic. It is at risk. There are so many things that could be, that are costing the arts its future with regard to the pandemic, and we are doing everything that we can. You can do that too, as those wonderful individuals have by visiting jazzemergencyfund.com, or coming up on June 10th and 11th, the Columbus Foundation will launch the Big Give. That's 25 hours of giving where you can donate to Jazz Arts Group through the Columbus Foundation. The benefit of doing that is that they amplify the gift, so your gift will go even further. Again, that's June 10th and 11th. So you can find the Big Give. You can find Jazz Arts Group at jazzartsgroup.org. You'll see all the info that you need there about the Big Give, and we'd love it if you could do that then so that you can amplify your gift, all of that going toward keeping Jazz Arts Group alive and well. So this episode of Offstage Live is another near and dear to my heart because we are interviewing somebody that has been an incredible mentor to me. I first met the great Vaughn Wiester when I was a freshman at Capital University. I'm a drummer, but I later ended up playing saxophone in his ensemble. And in the short time that I studied with Vaughn and have now gone to see his band on Monday nights, one thing is for certain, and I'm not alone in believing that Vaughn Wiester is a true legend of music here in Columbus. He's somebody that everyone looks up to. Everyone that is in this jazz community has had part of their education through Vaughn, and I'm so thrilled to have him with us to discuss his incredible career, his band, his writing, and everything else. And I believe this is one of his first forays into social media. So without further ado, I'm going to bring to the stage Mr. Vaughn Wiester. Vaughn, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Zach. Thank you.
I hope that all of those pleasant things didn't go to your head or anything. You know,
I feel like a different guy now.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Man, it's so great to see you here in the Offstage Live platform. I know that the audience has been clamoring to see you here. We had some great stories with Ray when we talked about the history of the Jazz Arts Group and the Columbus Jazz Orchestra, and I thought, you know, we had to get you on here to start to talk. So first and foremost, it's the pandemic. I know that your Monday night band that's been around for 23 years now. Is that right?
Correct.
So that obviously is on hold. I know that you're working just as hard as I know Jazz Arts Group is working to try to imagine the future for the band. Just give me a little bit of an update on how life has been for you during all of this chaos.
Well, I'm happy to say that I haven't gained any weight. I was kind of concerned about that, but I'm keeping a wary eye on that. And thanks to one of Columbus' better musicians, Dale Maraki, I got a little inspiration about a little trick I'm trying on, see if I can lose a little more just for fun.
That's great.
Dale has been very successful. 30 pounds, he was bragging to me. I said,
wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Dale. And I understand you've been riding the bike a little bit too.
I'm riding a bicycle an hour a day and enjoying it immensely. And I think I'm actually starting to get a little bit stronger, which is not a bad thing.
That's not a bad thing at all. Well, there's so many things that we could talk about in an hour's time. But first, I think it would be interesting, so many people know about your band, about your writing, and just your involvement in our music community, Columbus and beyond. But I'm not sure how many people know about the beginnings of Von Wiester. And I know that you were born and raised in Mount Vernon, Ohio. Just talk a little bit about your upbringings, particularly talking about music. I know that it wasn't long before you got bit by the music bug. So just talk to us just for a second about those early days in Mount Vernon.
Well, I'm happy to. I've given this a little thought here to try to organize it. I must have been around 8 years old one cold evening when I was out with a mixed bunch of people, grown-ups and children, doing Christmas carols, going to different people's houses and singing Christmas carols. And we get to this one place, and I'm standing next to a grown-up guy, and we're singing a Christmas carol that everybody knows. And I knew all the Christmas carols, but I noticed that this guy next to me is singing different notes. And I'm going, how does he know about those notes? And I noticed that those notes sounded pretty good. So that was a bit of an epiphany. It was the first time I actually noticed anything about music other than just tunes that, especially Christmas carols. That brings music to a lot of people, and it certainly did to me. Not long after that, there was this little lady who would teach us a music class 1 hour a week when I was in 3rd grade. Her name was Vivian Eberly, and she couldn't have been much over 4 feet tall. She was dinky. And so as a result of that Christmas carol experience, I had kind of figured out, I didn't know what a third was, but what I was trying to do was, whatever the melody was, I was trying to drop a third below and just follow the melody a third below. Well, so we're singing in the class. We've got these books, and she detected me trying to do that. She didn't attract any attention in the class to me in any way. She was so cool. She came over and stood by me, and she sang the harmony part standing next to me. That was my very first music lesson.
Wow.
Miss Eberly gave me my first music lesson. So that was kind of getting started, of actually being aware of music. The next biggie was in 1960 in the summer. My high school band director was a guy named Robert Bechtel. And I was at his house. There he is. That's a picture of him from around 1959 or 1960 out of the yearbook. I took a picture of that, and I want to make sure everybody could see Robert Bechtel. He too was kind of diminutive. He was very little over 5 feet tall, but a great trombone player and a great educator. But one summer afternoon, he lived about 2 blocks from us, and I was at his house for reasons I can't recall. And he took a shot at Lawrence Welk, and I had heard him do it before. And so I thought, well, I'm going to corner him. I said, Mr. Bechtel, you're always taking shots at Lawrence Welk. Me and the family, we watch Lawrence Welk every week. I don't see anything wrong with it. He just kind of looked at me. He said, wait here. He goes back in his bedroom. He's on his hands and knees in the back of his closet. He comes back out with 6 78 RPM records of Stan Kenton, whom I had never heard of. He hands them to me, and he looks me in the eye, and he says, take these home and listen to them and watch Lawrence Welk next week. That's all he said.
Right.
I figured out years later that was typical of his message, not just to me, but to any student. I distill his message this way. Do you think you're smart enough to get this? That's kind of the way he was. He wouldn't lead you by the hand, and he wouldn't try to sell you anything.
Well, before you go any further with that, I'm curious because you mentioned you were over at his house for something, and this is right around 1960. Growing up in Mount Vernon, was music and the arts highly valued? Did you feel like overall the community around the arts allowed you just, hey, I'm going to go to my music teacher's house? How did that kind of culture for music happen?
I don't know. I played in the bands at school. That's all I know. I didn't have any money. I didn't have a car. I wasn't about the town or anything like that. I was at school or I was at home. In the summer, that was a summer day. I can't recall why I was at his house. But, so needless to say, I heard Lawrence Welk next week with new ears. And that was my first understanding that there is a difference. It's not all the same. And so Stan Kenton right then became my hero. Okay, because it really turned me on. That was all 78, so those were things from the 40s. Okay, so I very quickly became a Stan Kenton fan. So Bechtel introduced me to that. And then not long after that, my barber, a guy named Howard Shackle at the family barber shop, he was a jazz fan, and he knew I was kind of interested. And he gave me an LP called Contemporary Concepts by Stan Kenton.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's how I found out about Bill Holman. And
Right.
I think I'm in 10th grade. Okay. So this was all very mind opening for me to understand this stuff. And of course, later on, I was disappointed with almost everything else I heard by Stan Kenton because none of it was quite that good.
Well, and while you mentioned Bill Holman, this is fast forwarding quite a bit, but to imagine being in 10th grade, that one day you would have none other than Bill Holman
Well,
featured with the famous jazz orchestra.
thanks to Eubanks, I met Holman because Ray brought him in 1980. And ever since I met Holman, he's always treated me like a friend, which you can't expect that, but it's always been great. In fact, I was on the phone with him just last Thursday, which was his 93rd birthday.
Wow.
And in fact, here's what he told me. He said his entire band gave him a Zoom birthday. They were on Zoom for 2.5 hours partying with Holman.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Now, Ray mentioned something. I believe it was Holman that wasn't, when he came there in the 80s, he wasn't playing the tenor saxophone anymore. But Ray convinced him to play.
Ray convinced him to play. But Holman had given up the tenor quite a few years prior to that because he was a cancer survivor, and he had cancer of the salivary glands and had part of his tongue removed. So that, as far as he was concerned, had kind of put an end to his tenor playing, which is a shame because he wasn't taking a back seat to very many people as a tenor player back in the 50s and early 60s. He was a good tenor player. So Bechtel was very influential in my life because of, not just because he handed me those records, but he also led the high school dance band. Now, at Mount Vernon High School, the football team and the basketball team are called the Yellow Jackets.
Okay.
The dance band, the Mellow Jackets. Okay, and to this day, it's no longer considered a dance band; it's considered a jazz ensemble, but it's still called the Mellow Jackets.
That's great.
So I'm playing in the Mellow Jackets, and I'm learning the style, and I have a list of tunes that I learned playing in that band. It's close to 50 tunes that I learned playing in that band, standard tunes, and also after about a year of that, Bechtel realized. I think he saw that I had some talent, some ability, and he also saw that I was really interested. And he wangled me a spot on a grown-up band operating in the area, Mansfield, Mount Vernon, Marion, led by a guy named Riley Norris. And so I got to play with a bunch of grown-up guys. Now there's in that picture, I'm on the far right behind the lady. That's me. Yep, right there. And then two over in the trombone section, there's Bechtel looking over his shoulder at Riley, and Riley's in the back, probably reaching in his shirt pocket for a cigarette or something. Okay. That picture was taken on Labor Day in 1961 when I had just returned less than a week prior to that from the Stan Kenton Clinic where I spent 2 weeks. And believe me, in this picture, I am totally on fire.
And I want to hear more about the Riley Band, but I want to. You mentioned the Stan Kenton camp.
Yeah.
While you're on it, talk about this photo.
Well, this is a guy named Ken Murray, who was the president of what was called National Stage Band Camps that had adopted the name when Stan Kenton got interested. They had adopted the name Stan Kenton Clinic. And the Mellow Jackets had come down to Eastmore High School for the second annual Ziggy Coyle Music Festival. And I was one of two soloists who won awards, scholarships to the Stan Kenton Clinic. Incidentally, the guy in the background that you can barely see, this leads me to believe my memory's not good, but this has to be the Al Waslan Band on the stage, and that is Frank Kenton sitting right there with an alto saxophone in his hand, one of the great musical legends of those days here in Columbus, Ohio. A great legend in what was then known as the Columbus Philharmonic, clarinet player, and played in all the dance bands, played in the Philharmonic. Quite an interesting cat. John, it knocks me out to be in a picture with Frank Kenton, but there I am at 157 pounds in my Mellow Jackets jacket, receiving my award from Ken Murray to go to the Kenton Clinic later that summer.
So, Vaughn, what color was that jacket?
Kind of a dark bronze.
Okay.
Black highlights and a black lapel. And when I became a member of the Mellow Jackets, I went downtown Mount Vernon to the men's store and I bought a tie bow tie. I said, now I'm a man, and I taught myself to tie a bow tie. Ever since then, I have tied my bow ties.
Good for you. So you were talking about the Riley Norris Band and how important of an experience that was for you.
Absolutely. Not just because I was playing with grown-up guys, but if you looked at that picture, you notice that there's 4 saxes and 3 of them are tenors. So it's a Woody Herman style sax section. It's not the standard 2 altos, 2 tenors, and a baritone.
Mm-hmm.
The whole book was custom written for Riley's band by a guy named Dick Cohn, who had co-led a band here in Columbus with Sonny McBroom for a number of years at Ohio State called the Cohn-McBroom Band.
Wow.
Dick Cohn wrote that entire book. Well, what I noticed when I got in the band was it wasn't just that it was grown-up guys, it was the writing that made that band sound completely different from the Mellow Jackets. The Mellow Jackets were playing published stocks.
Right.
Here we are playing hand copies, India ink, which is different because it looks completely different than the published stuff. And what a sound. And so right away, I'm totally captured by the sound of the band. I'm going, what does this guy Dick Cohn have to know to get this sound? He knows very well it's going to sound like this. How does he know? And that really got me, and I've been on fire with that ever since.
Yeah.
So Dick Cohn, I always say, is the greatest teacher I ever had that I never met. I was never in the same room with Dick Cohn, but I played his charts, and as a matter of fact, I have a number of them in the famous Jazz Orchestra library.
Well, and we're gonna play one of those when we get to the band. You've said something before about 1950s jazz. It's talking, I think, more about big band jazz, that basically you can put a timestamp on it, but it has a timeless quality about it. Yeah. And of course, this was that formative chunk of time, musically speaking, that you're coming up, you're in your teens, and this was just less than a decade prior, or maybe a decade prior.
Precisely.
It's so fresh.
Contemporary Concepts by Kenton was recorded in 1955. Right. I'm listening to it in 1961.
Right.
But in the years since then, I've come to understand 50s jazz as a classic style. Because here, in a certain way, it can be argued that jazz comes to its fullest fruition in the 50s without having to abandon its basic principles, such as popular song form and so forth, and to adopt rock, which I'm not saying it was wrong to do that, but 50s jazz has a way. It's like I always equate it to Beethoven. When you hear Beethoven, you can date Beethoven. You can say, oh, well, that's early 19th century, late, mature 18th century, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't sound dated. It still sounds new and fresh. It sounds modern. It sounds good. It sounds right. It doesn't sound dated. And 50s jazz has a tendency to hit you that way. Okay. Right. The other styles, even post-50s styles, often sound dated. Okay, a lot of that jazz rock from the 50s now is hopelessly dated, but the 50s style jazz isn't not so easily dated.
Well, I appreciate that you mentioned the Beethoven the comparison, because that sort of segues into sort of the last piece of your musical development. I wanted to get a quick little synopsis of. That was your exposure to the Rite of Spring. And one of the things to sort of set that up, I've always been astounded by, and I think so many people in the community have been astounded by. You don't just hand people jazz records and say, go check this out, although you do that a lot. You'll hand someone a Brazilian record. I have a stack of Brazilian CDs in my office that you gave me when you were thinning out your herd. But you also will hand people scores and classical records. And I've always been blown away by the fact that you've always been a careful student, but you've been diligent. You have something to say about all music. You ingest it all, basically. Talk a little bit about Rite of Spring and how that sort of set the tone for you to be able to have that wide palette.
Well, I had 2 experiences that opened the door to, quote, classical music. The first was the other band director at Mount Vernon High School was a gentleman named Jack Stauch, S-T-A-U-C-H. Quite the dignified gentleman, but not a pretentious bone in his body. Whenever he was leading the band, you had this enormous sense that this was totally worthwhile. And that was what he invested in you, and he got great musical results. Well, he lived about a block away from our house. And one evening, he invited me over to his house. I went to his house. He sat me down on the sofa and gave me a Coca-Cola, and he put on a recording of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. And he informed me that the music I was about to hear had been written in 1911. And here come all these big, juicy chords that have got more than 3 notes in them. They've got major sevenths embedded in them, and they've got half steps embedded in them. 40 minutes of just the most sumptuous, beautiful harmony you'll ever hear. And it has become one of my lifetime favorites. And anybody out there that ever sits down and listens to Daphnis and Chloe, you'll see right away what I'm talking about. It'll catch you. So Mr. Stow did that for me. He introduced me to that. That's one of my lifetime favorite pieces of music. That was my first door opening to classical music. Not long after that, Mrs. Carl, K-A-H-R-L, Evelyn Carl, this sweet, lovely lady, was the mother of a schoolmate who was a very talented musician. He was an organist and a cellist, and he had taken up an interest in jazz piano. He was very interested in Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk, so I learned a lot from Bob Carl. But Evelyn Carl had been trained at what was then known as the Cincinnati Conservatory, and she was a violinist. And one day I'm at her house, and she knew I was kind of on fire with music and couldn't get enough. So she hands me a record. It's Pierre Monteau and the Paris Conservatory Orchestra playing Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And she handed me that record, and she said in a very unpresumptuous way, I think you should take this home and listen to it. Thanks, Mrs. Carl. So I take this record home. I'm playing this record. It's terrifying. I had never imagined anything so violent or ugly. And it's just hitting me from the left and hitting the beginning of it. I felt like there were bugs crawling on me. It was like a physical experience.
Yeah.
I think I managed to make it all the way through the piece, maybe twice. And, so I took it back. I said, Mrs. Carl, thank you, but I can't imagine why anybody would want to listen to music that sounds like this. It was totally non-judgmental. She said, that's all right. And she very graciously took the record back from me, and that was that. Well, about a week later, one morning, I wake up early, and there's a shaft of sunlight coming in my bedroom. And across the room from me is my kid brother asleep in his bed. And I can hear a few bars of the Rite of Spring in my head. And I couldn't remember what came next. Mrs. Carl, can I borrow that record? I didn't go after the Rite of Spring. It came after me.
Yeah.
And so, in the intervening years, I have come to understand that I am the property of the Rite of Spring.
Absolutely. Well, and our dear friend Kathy Hope Cunningham on Facebook says Todd likes to tell a story of checking out Vaughn's home library, which was largely classical, and he had everything, more than most classical musicians themselves. So I think, as I mentioned, everyone can testify to that. And it's something that I think, and we'll talk about your years as an educator, it's something that I think instilled in all of your students this holistic view of music. It's not about that one thing that you're into. It's about a wider view of the entirety of what you can take in and what moves you. With that, I want to talk about moving. Of course, you went to the Navy and then made your way to Ohio State. Talk just for a second about leaving Mount Vernon on our way to Ohio State. And I want to get to Woody Herman pretty quickly here. Give me the summary of the leaving Mount Vernon.
Well, the day after I graduated from Mount Vernon High School, I joined the Navy. 2 reasons. 1, to declare my independence from my father, which we both badly needed. And 2, to start my musical career, because the Navy guaranteed me, if I passed the audition, that I could attend the Navy Music School and potentially have a musical career. Well, I passed the audition, I went to music school, and I ended up serving in the Mediterranean for the rest of my Navy career. And the Navy Music School was very good for me because I was no longer a big fish in a little pond. There were, about 60% of the guys I was better than, but there was a whole bunch of guys that had something to show me.
Yes.
So that was a great experience. The music school was near Washington, D.C. One time I went downtown and heard the New York Philharmonic with Leonard Bernstein. They played the Firebird Suite by Stravinsky, and they introduced me to my surprise, William Schumann's Third Symphony. I was expecting Robert Schumann, but no, William Schumann. Ooh, the very next day I bought that record and I bought that score, and that's been one of my lifetime favorites. So the Navy school and the whole Navy experience and being in the Mediterranean, visiting all those Mediterranean ports and just being a musician, doing those things, that was all very, very good for me. That's so great. That was the beginning of my musical career for sure.
And then you made your way, you came back, you went to Ohio State, is that right?
I came back and I attended Ohio State for 1 quarter and I quit while I was behind. I met a lot of very interesting people in the process while I was there. Of course, my trombone teacher was Jack. I just scared it right out of myself. Jack, oh, come on. Shame on me. There's a whole lot of guys right now. But,
that's all right.
But it was Jack. Okay. Yeah. And he was very frustrated with me as a trombone student. But I met a lot of guys. And one of the interesting things I got to do while I was at Ohio State was the Columbus Symphony with Evan Whalen was going to do an Appalachia tour. It lasted 3 days, riding a bus through southern and southeastern Ohio. And the bass trombone player couldn't make it, so I got hired to make the tour. Wow. That's where I met Nick Perini.
Yep.
So that's how long I've known Nick. You know, we sat side by side on that bus, just carrying on and talking and everything. And of course, by that time, this is 1967. I'm growing my hair real long. Okay. You know, so I'm quite a spectacle. Okay. But I could play a little bit, you know, on the bass trombone, which was my instrument by that time.
Sure. By that time, Vaughn, were you already starting to write your own charts or when did that start?
I had dabbled when I was in the Navy. When I was in that band in the Mediterranean, I shot a couple things that were a little bit fanciful, you know, reasonably successful. I didn't get any, you know, commissions or, you know, nothing really big came of it. But, you know, I did a little bit. And, you know, I was listening, by that time I was listening to Gil Evans and some other things and getting some pretty interesting ideas of what music could sound like. Gil Evans can do that to you, you know.
Yeah. Speaking of Evans, Vaughn, people are guessing in the comments, was it Jack Evans?
Jack Evans.
There we go.
Yeah. Thank you for the help there. I don't know if I drew a blank there.
That's okay.
So the Appalachia tour, I met Nick Perini. And after I left Ohio State, at Ohio State, I played in the symphony orchestra under, I scared that out of myself, Hardesty.
Okay.
Hardesty was the conductor, and my big memory from that was the Sibelius First Symphony. Played in the wind. I think it was called the concert band, and now I'm going to have to. I didn't write it down. He just passed away. Okay, well, I'm going to need some help here.
Yeah, that's all right.
But I played in the brass choir under Richard Suddendorf. You know, I learned a lot under those guys in the very short time. In that time, in those days, it was on the quarter system, so you were in and out in a hurry. But I quit while I was behind, and 2 days later, I got a job at Discount Records right across the street. The manager was a guy named Al Franz, F-R-A-N-Z. He was a big Cleveland Orchestra fan, and he was a big audiophile. He loved the recordings. He loved the music. He loved the orchestras. He had no time for the Columbus Symphony. He was quite the elitist when it came to classical music. And he really introduced me to an awful lot of really great music. So I owe a great deal to Al Franz, who lost his life in an automobile accident a number of years ago. But around this time, within a very short time, I had met the following people. Chuck Selby. I played my first gig at Valley Dale with Chuck Selby's orchestra. I had met Al Waslan, and I'd played for him. I had met David Height and played a few gigs in the summer with the Kenley Players. I had met Ray Eubanks and his buddy Jerry Kay. While I was at Discount Records, I met Dick Mackey and I met Dave Workman. And I ended up in a band with Dave. I organized a horn section so we could start doing Blood, Sweat, and Tears and do old stuff. which was a great education for me because that was where I really started learning about black music. Being, you know, a kid from Mount Vernon, Ohio, what did I know? So, and I met a guy named Paul Moeller, Molleur, who was a piano player, and he was the contractor at the Ohio Theater. And in the summer of 1974, May of 74, he contracted me to play at the Ohio Theater for Peggy Lee. One rehearsal, 8 shows in a week.
Wow.
Entire orchestra except the piano and the bass. The piano and the bass came to town with Peggy Lee, and the rest of the orchestra was all from Columbus except the first trumpet player, a guy named Frank Brown. I didn't know anything about Frank Brown. Turns out he was the creator of jazz studies at Cincinnati Conservatory.
Oh, wow.
And he was playing first trumpet.
Yeah.
And he was this dark-looking character, and I just didn't feel like I was going to step up to him and say anything cute, you know. So I gave him plenty of room. Middle of the week, he steps up to me on a break, walks right up to me, says, "You sound real good." I said, "Thanks, so do you." He says, "Would you like to go on the road?" Total surprise. I'm not expecting this. I said, "Well, as long as there's not too much nonsense, I could go on the road for a little while." He goes, "I'm going to recommend you to Woody Herman."
Wow.
And walks away.
Wow.
This is in May. In August, the phone rings.
Well, before we get into Woody Herman, I have to ask you one question. So right in the middle of that was, of course, Ladd McIntosh had a band at Ohio State. Well, you know, based around Ohio State. Ohio State had a jazz ensemble that was budding. Ray Eubanks would start a jazz ensemble at Capital University, and then finally, the Jazz Arts Group in 1972 starts to form. You're there. So talk about the formulation of those bands and JAG and what was going on from your perspective in Columbus at that time.
What was going on for me was the Dave Workman Blues Band. Now, McIntosh had that band, but I couldn't get in. There was this guy named John Johansson, who's now an Episcopal priest.
He's on our board. He's been on our education. I love John.
He's a good guy. Yeah, we get along now pretty good. I didn't like him for a while because he played way too well. I could not move into that seat. Okay. Later on, Ladd had a pop type band, like a small big band called the Live New Breed.
New Breed.
A couple of times I got to sit in with that. Ray's thing at Capitol, I never had anything to do with, but I got to sit in a couple times with the budding beginning Jazz Arts Group. And I think I was more or less a regular member by the time I joined Woody.
Yeah.
Okay. And Woody and Ray had decided he would save my seat, which was very gracious of him. And he got, I can't remember that guy, George Moran played bass trombone, who was a very promising student at Capitol playing bass trombone. So George Moran took my place while I was gone. George Moran did shows in New York City.
One thing that I noticed on the back of a Woody Herman record that Jeff Hamilton's on, you have a contribution, an arrangement that was recorded. I think this was after you were rolled off the band. Do you recall the tune? I'm blanking on the tune name right now.
A Mingus tune called Duke Ellington's Sound of Love.
Sound of Love, which I love your arrangement of that. I want to ask you, so obviously you had started writing more seriously into the 70s. When did your writing, when did you start to contribute charts for Jazz Arts Group? Was that right away after you had joined?
Well, I don't recall, I'm very hazy on when what happened.
Sure.
But basically, I don't even remember what the things were, but it just kind of started with Ray. I often say, if you can write an arrangement, that's one thing. But if somebody starts using you and then using you again and using you again, maybe you're an arranger now.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Vaughn, because as we've talked offline, the number of charts that are in our libraries here at the Jazz Academy that have your name on them are over 200. And that number jumped out to you, and I was like, wow, 131 original arrangements, 40 transcriptions where you pulled something off of a recording, and 28 updated editions, among which I know your updated edition of Take the A Train is one that I feel like has been played a million times just in the time that I've been in Columbus. Have you thought, you didn't just get called back a few times. 200 charts later, you've contributed quite a bit to the legacy of Jag.
Well, Ray kept me very busy.
Yeah.
What can I say? I'm forever in his debt. Ray turned me into three things. He turned me into a teacher, he turned me into an arranger, and he turned me into a band leader.
Well, you would come back and become the teacher after a stint with Woody Herman. So here we are. You're given the call in August of which year to join Woody Herman?
I was in Woody's band from August of 74 to July of 76. So it's not quite 2 years.
Talk about how important that experience was for you.
If words fail me. There's no way to describe what it's like being on a road band, especially one where the leader expects everyone to do their best. Where the guys, he so expects everyone to do their best that even when Woody would leave early on a dance gig, there was no messing around.
Yeah.
The band still played well.
Here's a picture of you with Woody here in the left side of this photo.
Yeah.
I love those big collars you're wearing there. And here's another one.
This is 1974, right? Yep. I call those the Sunoco suits. In the foreground in the trumpet section, that's Dennis Dotson, one of my favorite players. Now, I think Jim Pugh must have been gone that night because that's a guy named Bill Reichenbach on trombone next to me. First trumpet, the black guy, that's Jeff Davis. In between Dennis and Jeff, that's Johnny Hoffman, who has spent the rest of his life, as far as I know, in Australia. And that's Dale Kirkland, the other trombone, and that's Steve Houghton on drums.
Oh, my former teacher, my master's degree. I love Steve, and wishing him an incredible retirement. He just retired after many years at Indiana as well.
Retired, exactly.
Yep. That's right. So obviously, as you mentioned, it's hard to put into words, but those years on Woody Herman's band, you talked about Navy school being one of those that you leveled up during that time. You had to come off Woody's band, and from a musicianship perspective, you had to feel like that was another degree, even though it wasn't school.
Absolutely. In fact, when I was teaching at Capitol, I always told the musicians, the ideal situation is you're the weakest guy on the band and they keep you.
Right.
They kept me.
Right. Well, so how would you summarize, we've talked so much and we haven't even gotten to the famous jazz orchestra, which is pretty amazing, but how would you summarize for everyone? You mentioned going on the road with the band and how important that was. How would you summarize that experience for people? It's a totally different time now. There aren't as many traveling bands. Talk about how unique that experience was for you.
Well, I lucked out. I was at the very end of the era.
Yeah.
He was still alive. Stan was gone. I'm trying to think. I think Duke was gone by that time, and Basie might have been gone by that time. Okay. If not, it was soon after that. I mean, so this is literally the end of the era. The only bands after that, after Woody, was the Tommy Dorsey band with Buddy Morrow. They kept going, and that was a great band. If I had known then what I know now, when I got off of Woody's band, I would have tried to get on Buddy's band. It was a good band, and it was a good book. But, I didn't have any idea how good it was till much later. But and the other band that was on the road all the time was the Miller Band.
Right.
That kept going. That has always been a very young band.
Right.
But as you know, our good friend Ryan Hamilton spent 2 years on that band, which, I'm sure he'll tell you, there's nothing to replace an experience like that.
Right. Well, so I mentioned the number of charts that you contributed. I think it's time to give the audience just a quick listen to a chart that you wrote to feature Eddie Daniels, but you've kept it in your book all this time. It's one that I think I've played sitting in with the band. I've heard it a bunch of times. We're going to play a clip from Begin the Begin, which was recorded on Rogers Roars Porter Soars for Jazz Arts Group. And then when we come back, I want to get your take on that chart, and then we're going to talk about the famous jazz orchestra.
Okay.
Here's Begin the Begin. Wow. Incredible writing, first of all, Vaughn, but Eddie Daniels blowing on that, playing in general is, oh my goodness. Talk just a second about that arrangement and about Eddie Daniels.
Well, I'm so proud of that. The band plays it so beautifully. You know, it was everything I had hoped it would be as I wrote it. And to have Eddie Daniels on there, I mean, just look out, Katie bar the door. You know,
Right.
the guy could do anything at any time and not mess himself up.
Right.
Just really, but I'll tell you, a great point of pride. There are two great points of pride for me on this CD. One is how well the band played my arrangements, which it knocks me out. Every single one of them it's like a dream come true to hear them play these things. And the other thing is that the album is half my arrangements, and the other half Gary Carney arrangements.
That's right.
I'm in really good company here. So you know, you talk about a feather in my cap. There it is.
Vaughn, take a moment and remind and tell our audience who was Gary Carney.
Gary Carney came from Newcomers Town. Gary was a brilliant trombone player and a brilliant arranger. Not only that, he was a composer, which I can't call myself a composer. But Carney was quite a great gentleman. He had a very shy, taciturn disposition. You know, and for a while there, he was literally painfully shy. But then to everybody's overwhelming surprise, he got in with Michelle Horsfield, and they ended up married, and they ended up just being the perfect couple. Michelle was always in midair, going off all the time, and Gary would always be going, yes, sure. So he was quite a personality, a magnificent trombone player, and a great writer. I don't know what else to say. A lot of people regarded him as a slow motion Carl Fontana on the trombone. Every note was a pearl.
Wow. I want to finish talking about FJO, but first, just a brief moment. you ended up teaching a total of 17 years at Capitol, is my understanding. Two different tours, if you will. I was very fortunate, as I said at the intro, to be in your 9-piece group, playing baritone saxophone, and I remember being scared out of my life, but every rehearsal was what brought new wisdom. It wasn't, you never phoned in those rehearsals. You were present. You were offering. I also, uniquely enough, my father was in the big band in the earlier time under you as well, playing saxophone as well. Not only the Compton family, but Matt Adams, Brian Kuhn, on and on and on and on. People that are still playing. The list goes on. That, I think, it goes without saying what you did for students, but talk about what teaching at Capitol meant for your developments, starting in 1977 throughout. You mentioned Ray was a big part of that, but just talk a little bit, just for a second, about teaching at Capitol University.
Well, there's an old saw that says, it's the teacher that learns the most. And as time went on, I began to realize I'm doing a lot of learning and a lot of growing here. That, I often had students tell me that I was giving them something good, but I always had to look at them and say, you have no idea what you're giving me. So it really is, Zach, you're going to find the same thing. It's going to happen to you. But you're going to end up saying the teacher gains the most. But what it is it's a chance. There's a thing here that is so worth sharing, and you got an opportunity to share it. Hey, all there is to do is to go. Okay, so and it's pretty easy to get up ahead of steam and to get some energy going. If you go at it that way. Every year I had the band, it wasn't long before whatever music we were playing, the band owned that music, no matter how hard it was. At first, we're all thumbs, but a couple of weeks in, and after the first snack bar concert, the band owned all that music.
Wow.
It was great.
Yeah.
It's not just learning about music. It's a spiritual thing, man.
Absolutely. I want to transition to close out this last sort of segment, talking about your band, and everything you just said about teaching, your writing, your journey. It's like you could write the Vaughn Wiester story, just the way that it's so clearly narrated how big of a deal music was for you and how you ran with that ball. In the early 90s, you had left the Jazz Arts Group, happy about your time there. You had made incredible contributions that are lasting, but you were without a band of yours or one to write for regularly. And you were just telling me before we started that a couple gentlemen, Todd Stoll included, came to you and said, man, it's only hurting yourself, basically, not to have a band. And you started thinking about it. Tell us about the conception of the famous jazz orchestra. And I think the Columbus Music Hall was a pretty important start with that as well. Talk a little bit about the beginnings.
Well, the band actually started at a place called the Olszewski Inn in about, I'm going to guess it was either 1991 or 1992. That band, that version of the famous jazz orchestra lasted about a year and a half. There was a dingy restaurant nightclub called Ole's, what used to be called the Olszewski Inn. It's now called the Cap City Diner. It was completely given a remodeling job. But it was a good acoustic situation. The place was a little dingy, but we didn't mind, and we had a great time there. And I was fishing for a name for the band, and it took me about 15 seconds. I was thinking, what am I going to call the band? And this image of the old black label 78 RPM RCA Victor appeared in my head, Duke Ellington and his famous orchestra. And I thought, how can I get famous in there? So that's how I came up with Famous Jazz Orchestra. It took just a few seconds. But that lasted a short time. But then after I was terminated at Capitol University, after that, I went on the cruise ships for about a year. When I came back, I heard Todd Stoll's band at the Columbus Music Hall.
The Jazz to Go band.
Yeah, Jazz to Go. they did their Christmas show, Christmas of '96. And I realized right away, here's a place where I could bring the band. And I really had to work on Becky to persuade her to let us in. But I want to go back to the first band, the first time I had the band. It was Todd Stoll and Al Gels. Kind of ganged up on me. You know, God bless Al Gels, whom we lost so many years ago. But those are the guys that put the bite on me. They said, basically, your reward for not starting a band is you don't have a band. And the guy that alerted me to the Olentangy Inn was none other than Dick Mackey. He said,
"Oh wow."
He said, "Vaughn, you should take a look at this place." And I went in there, and the next thing I know, I've got a deal, and we started the band.
Wow.
Anyway, but in 1997, in February of 1997, my crowbar on Becky was successful, and she relented and let me in once every 2 weeks. Now I thought, I'll take it for now, but it's got to be once a week.
Yeah.
But finally, we were in there for once a week, and I think Becky was pretty satisfied that we had a good thing going.
Vaughn, why was it important at that time to have a band that you front? You know, where were you at thinking about? Was it to be able to play your arrangements, or the entire book being something that you get to curate, so to speak? What was the instant appeal at that time that pulled you into? Because look, I mean, I've helped you set up on Sundays before a Monday concert. I have a band that's played intermittently. Leading a big band is not an easy task. It's a little bit of a thankless job, if not for the music. So I suspect that was part of it for you. Is that right?
Well, you know, I like to say it this way, that you might come to a point in your life where you ask yourself, how bad do I want to do this?
Right.
Okay. You know, and I'm willing to say, I know the answer.
But what was the major thing you were missing, I guess I could say, in the 90s, thinking about that sort of sparked the formation?
Well, I think, you know, the real inspiration for the whole thing, which I forgot to mention, I got to backtrack a little bit here.
Sorry.
In the 80s, I got invited to play with the Blue Wisp Band in Cincinnati a few times. And I realized this is a band that plays every week for no money. And these guys, and it's I'm sitting with that band, and it's a killer band, and this drummer's throwing stuff at us left and right, and I'm going, man, it's all I can do to play my part here. Okay, so that's how I found out about John Von Ohlen and became friends with John and became friends with those guys in Cincinnati who are great players. That band is still going post John Von Ohlen. I think Jim Lesley is now the drummer, who is fabulous.
He is.
So, but that was an epiphany, you know, and that was what made me realize that in Columbus we had all the social bands, and we had Jazz Arts playing concerts, and we had a spot in the middle that nobody filled, which was once a week cabaret style. So that and Todd and Al Gels, that's the reason I started the band. So now I've got that covered. You know? Yeah. So back with you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's important. So I want to play before we sort of get to the legacy of the band. I want to talk. I know you want to mention the players in the band. I want to play a short chart because this sort of glues it all together. This is a chart from the Riley Norris Band on "It Could Happen to You." Okay. I want to, and this was Dick Cohn with the arrangement.
Right.
And I want to play a little sample. This is from your one of your CDs called "Playing the Book." It gives you a real intimate sound of the band. I think as soon as I hear these recordings, I feel like I'm there on a Monday night. So let's get just a little clip of that before we come back and wrap it up.
Cool.
What a nice chart.
See, that's the kind of stuff I got to play when I was a high school kid playing in Riley's band. Can you imagine
Wow.
what that was like, man? I'm going, wow, why does this sound like this?
No, I cannot imagine. What I love is that those charts have withstood the test of time, as you indicated. They're timeless charts. But how fun is it for you that your childhood is part of what you're doing now? You know, it all connects.
You're so right. You're so right.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I wanted to talk briefly about is guest artists with the band. There have been a few. You mentioned John Von Ohlen, the great Jeff Hamilton, drummer, who was a student of John Von Ohlen's.
4 times.
4 times. And then we talked about it earlier, but talk just for a second about what it was like the first time you brought Bill Holman in.
It was wonderful. It was Becky's idea. I never would have thought of it. Becky Ogden suggested that. My mother had just died, and I'm in there setting up. I said, Becky, you know, I just buried my mother. She said, well, let's bring in Bill Holman. I went, what? She said, it's better than flowers. That's how it happened. Now, look,
Wow.
we don't have a lot of time left. There's several things I want to mention.
Yes, please.
Our guest artist, we had Holman 5 times. We had Phil Wilson at least twice. We've had Jiggs Wiggum, I think, 3 times. Jeff Hamilton 4 times. We had John Von Ohlen a couple times with Ray. And we at last finally had John Fedchop, which, you know, shame on me. That should have been his 5th or 6th time. I also want to mention I had a lovely run with Kelly Delaveres with a band called Brasileira. We played a lot of Brazilian music. She still has that band going.
Right.
And that has been a really great experience. But if I can, we only have a few seconds, right?
Yeah, no, you're fine. Yeah, we don't have a hard exact stop, but we're just going to wrap it up when it's time.
If I may,
yes,
I would
please.
Like to run down in score order a list of the members of the famous jazz orchestra as of March 6th, which was our last performance for the time being. On Woodwinds, John Vermeulen, Jay Miglia, Brian Olszewski, Alex Burgoyne, and Bob Lebeau, the big brother of Football Hall of Famer Dick Lebeau. That's our saxophone section. Our trumpet section, first trumpet is Eric Gimbal from Galleon. Second trumpet is Larry Everhart, my doctor. Third trumpet is the fabulous Jim Powell. Fourth trumpet is Bob Lawson, who is probably right now sitting there cranking out some charts for us. Who knows what a stack of music that guy's going to show up with. Myeloma Nino that completes our trumpet section. Our trombone section is led by Ryan Hamilton. Next to him sits Matt Ellis, who is the heart and soul, the deacon of the band. John Hall on trombone. Our bass trombonist is a fabulous guy, Jeff Banyards. And on fifth trombone and tuba is Sean Maloney, who just really lights up the band with the sound of that tuba. Our horn section was created in its current form and led by Barbara Noakes, because it's now, at her suggestion, 3 horns instead of 2. Barbara Noakes, leader of what we now call the Blue Horns. Todd Swatzler on second horn. John Busick on third horn. Our rhythm section is comprised of Tom Davis on guitar, Terry Dowds on bass, Steve Shaw driving the bus from the drum set, and Jim Llewellyn, no replacement for that guy on piano. That's right. That's the famous jazz orchestra in its current incarnation.
Well, and I know that you're clamoring to get the band back together. Vaughn, I wanted to just share with you just a handful of comments. I know you're not big on social media, so here's our chance. Fred Meister says that you're a gentleman and a scholar and a monster musician. Jane Beaver says, hi, Vaughn. As your little sister, you're telling childhood stories that even I've never heard, which is very good. Derek Lagozo says, Vaughn, great to see you and hear you again. We all learned a tremendous amount from you. To this day, in teaching my ensembles, I refer to several things that you did at Capitol.
Wow, Lagozo, good guy.
Yep. And a number of other people. I think the moral of the story, Vaughn, is that the entire community in Columbus and even now far away from Columbus is indebted to you for your commitment to this music and your tireless pursuit of it. I think it's inspired everybody to stay as convicted as you at chasing it down. So as we conclude, any final statements you want to make?
Well, you're making me think that, if I've given something that can be given, God bless me, and God bless anybody that gives it, because it's so good. Why not give it? Let's give it. That's what it's for.
Yeah, well, there's no better way to end this. I think people are clamoring for part two. We've got some things that we're talking about in the works for the future. Vaughn, I want to thank you for joining us. Thanks for coming down to the Jazz Academy so we could properly social distance, but be close by to man all the technology. Wishing you all the best. Thank you so much. Huge thanks to our audience for watching. Please stick around Sunday. Byron Stripling, Bobby Floyd, and Micah Thomas. And keep following the Jazz Arts Group because we're going to keep bringing the jazz, as is Vaughn and the rest of our great community. Everyone have a great night.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, everybody.